Well, hello, everyone. I'm Gary Locke, former governor of Washington State, also former U.S. Secretary of Commerce and U.S. Ambassador to China. Both of those last jobs were during the Obama administration. And we've got a really exciting program today talking about China, the future of U.S.-China relationships and where we're headed, and basically what is the state of U.S.-China affairs. We've got two great speakers lined up, Professor Susan Shirk, from the University of California, San Diego, and also Kurt Campbell, who is now the Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs on the National Security Council. Before we hear from them, also want to acknowledge that we've got two great students who are assisting us in today's program, Ashley Kong and Megan Peters. I'll introduce our speakers and Ashley and Megan shortly. Let me just start off with some comments about China as kind of an introduction. And it's this. 47 years ago when President Nixon first visited China, I think it would have been impossible, very difficult to imagine how a very simple society he encountered would so dramatically transform itself into the modern China of today. The bicycle and the hutong alleys that characterized China even 25 years ago have given way to Audis, elevated freeways, and the world's biggest network of bullet trains going over 200 miles per hour. And they have built some 14,000 miles of bullet trains just in the last 10 years. That's enough to crisscross America 6 times. And then China has 1/2 of the world's mega super skyscrapers. China's society is changing beyond all recognition, and at the heart of the most sweeping and social economic transformation the world has seen is the rise of a powerful new and largely urban class. And the pace has just been extraordinary. As recently as the year 2000, only 4% of Chinese urban households were middle class. In the next few years, it's predicted to be 3/4 of all urban households and roughly 45% of the entire population. And the upper middle class, which now makes up about 14% of urban households, is expected in 8 years to become almost half the entire urban population. There are over 1 million millionaires in China and some 600 billionaires, compared to only like 65 billionaires 7 years ago. When Nixon first went to China, our yearly two-way trade was less than $100 million, and two-way investment in each other's country was virtually zero. Today, and also only a handful of jobs in both countries depended on trade with China. Today, roughly $1.5 billion of goods and services flow between our two countries every single day. And China is America's largest export destination outside of North America, with exports to China growing until recently almost twice the rate of exports to the rest of the world. We in the Commerce Department used to have a motto: the more that America exports, the more we make, the more workers we need. And that means jobs for the American people. America is China's largest export market. In fact, exports to the United States from China exceed all of the exports that China sends out to all the EU countries combined. So, and with the success that that the Chinese companies have achieved, they're going global and they're investing abroad. And the value of Chinese investment into the United States soared from virtually zero in 2000 to $46 billion in 2016, although a lot of it has dropped almost down to zero in just the last few years under the policies imposed by President Trump. So measured against the past, our two sides have made enormous progress. Millions and millions of jobs in America depend on two-way trade with China. And so people in both countries have benefited from this deepening economic integration. And it's against this backdrop of China's dramatic social and economic transformation that the United States and China find themselves in an intractable trade war. In a trade war, there are no winners, only losers on both sides, businesses, workers, and most of all, the consumers. To be sure, American and other foreign companies and governments have real issues with the industrial and economic and trade policies that China has used to get ahead. We're talking about discrimination against foreign companies that want to do business in China, sectors of the Chinese economy that are even off limits to foreign investment, weak protections of intellectual property, forced technology transfer as a condition of doing business in China, and government subsidies to government enterprises and advanced industries. And of course, a lot of news recently about government-sponsored hacking of foreign companies. But one has to question whether the former administration's across-the-board tariffs, and to no one's surprise, the Chinese retaliatory tariffs, are the best way to address America's concerns. In a scenario of dueling tariffs, American companies, workers, and consumers are being hurt, and the tariffs are not being paid for by China, but by American businesses and consumers. Indeed, the New York Fed and the Wall Street Journal say that the impact to the average American household ranges from $800 to $1,000 per day. And so much of what American consumers buy is made in China, so that we really don't have many substitutes available at a comparable price. On the other hand, Chinese tariffs on American goods entering China may not equally hurt Chinese companies and consumers. I mean, China doesn't have to buy American soybeans. They can buy from Brazil. They don't have to buy MRI or CAT scan medical equipment from GE. They can buy from the German companies. They don't have to buy Boeing airplanes. They can buy Airbus. So, you know, in the last 40 years, ever since the two countries formally recognized each other, the US-China relationship has actually become the world's most consequential bilateral or two-way relationship. And I think our speakers will talk a little bit more about that shortly. But it's fair to say that the US-China relationship today is at a pivotal point. Now, besides trade, part of the tensions between our two countries have to do with US charges of espionage and theft of intellectual property and trade secrets by Chinese visitors and by even Chinese Americans. And this threatens this espionage and hacking, theft of trade secrets and intellectual property, threatens America's economic prosperity and our competitiveness, and really endangers our national security. But there is a problem. Last year at a conference in Silicon Valley, two of America's most prominent American scientists, Dr. David Ho, who really came up with all the cures and the treatments for AIDS, and Nobel Prize winner Stephen Chu, who actually served as US Secretary of Energy under the Obama administration. They both talked about the growing wrongful prosecution of Chinese American scientists by the US government and the resulting lives ruined because of ethnic profiling, sloppy investigations, and a rush to judgment. Dr. Ho said that African Americans have the phrase driving while black to refer to the tendency for blacks to be stopped unfairly by the police for traffic violations compared to white motorists. Dr. Ho said there's a new similar phrase among Chinese scientists in America, researching while Chinese. So the tensions between the United States and China are having an impact on the lives of Chinese Americans here in America, not to mention the growing violence against Chinese Americans and all Asian Americans because of the rhetoric that the COVID-19 virus is the Wuhan virus, the China virus, or the Kung flu virus. So We have a lot of issues in front of us, and obviously the U.S.-China relationship and all of its ramifications in terms of our companies, our consumers, our businesses, our workers, but even people here at home. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Kurt Campbell serves as Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator of Indo-Pacific Affairs on the National Security Council. He was previously Chairman and Chief Executive of the Asia Group, a very strategic advisory and capital management consulting group. From 2009 to 2013, which is where I really got to know Mr. Campbell, he served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, where he's really widely credited for being the key architect of what is known as the pivot to Asia. And, you know, in all of his work, he's traveled all around the Asia Pacific region. And Secretary Hillary Clinton awarded him the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, the nation's highest diplomatic honor. Kurt was previously the CEO and co-founder of the Center for a New American Security and is currently director of the Aspen Strategy Group and chairman of the editorial board of the Washington Quarterly. He's the author of many, many books. I don't know where he finds the time to be such a prolific author with all of his other work. But here's an interesting fact, and it'll tie in with our next speaker. He received his BA from the University of California, San Diego, and he got his doctorate in international relations from Brasenose College at Oxford University. So now we turn to Susan Shirk, who is the chair of the 21st Century Center and research professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California at San Diego. So they too have a little bit of it in common. She's also the director emeritus at the University of California's Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. She first visited China in 1971 and has been teaching, researching, and engaging China diplomatically ever since. During the Clinton administration, from 1997 to 2000, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs, with responsibility for China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia. Now, that is virtually the same position that Kurt Campbell had. His was slightly higher in that division, but it's amazing from both connections with University of California, San Diego, and serving in the same bureau in the State Department dealing with Far Eastern policy. Dr. Shirk's publications are numerous, so many different books and so many articles, but she also co-chairs a task force of China experts that issued its second report called Course Correction Toward an Effective and Sustainable China Policy just a year ago. And she's a co-chair of the UC San Diego Forum on U.S.-China Relations. So, and she got her BA degree from Mount Holyoke and her master's degree from Berkeley and a PhD from MIT. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce our two outstanding, very distinguished experts on China, Kurt Campbell and Susan Shirk. So I'm going to ask them just to make some opening comments around a little theme. I was going to ask them something kind of maybe somewhat odd, but I'll change it instead. It'll be a bit easier. Why has our relationship with China become so much more contentious? And what are the risks of a relationship that is not just competitive, but actually hostile? What are the risks of such a hostile climate or relationship? And how did our relationship with China get to be so contentious? So we'll start with Kurt.
Thank you, Ambassador. And can I just tell you what a pleasure it is to be with both of you, two of my most favorite people. For the students in your class, I want you to know you could not imagine a more admirable, modest, and really truly devoted public servant than Ambassador Locke. He had been a Commerce Secretary and a governor, done all these things. But when I first really worked with him when he was in Beijing, he was extremely down to earth, very committed to the relationship, understood its challenges, but was really prepared to roll up his sleeves and work hard for the betterment of the people in both countries. And Gary, Ambassador Locke, my relations with Susan actually go deeper than that. She was my professor at UC San Diego. I was only a couple years younger than she was, but I was not a very serious student, kind of a surfer, and she doesn't remember it very clearly. I don't remember it that much either, but I will say, for probably each for different reasons, we won't get into that, but she saw something in me, she encouraged me, and we had the good fortune of working together in a variety of capacities. Most recently, Susan and Steve Hadley and the team at UC San Diego have put together really the foremost effort to understand and to really explore the relationship between these two critical countries, the United States and China. I will also say, just very quickly before getting started, you have things that really kind of have meaning for you. I remember when I worked with Susan when she was at the State Department, and this gives you a little bit of something about her. She had a wonderful little picture that she still keeps on her desk. It's a black and white picture of her as a young person shaking hands, I think on one of her first trips to China with Zhou Enlai. And you can see in her face excitement, hope, anticipation. And I remember I'd always look at that picture and it would remind me about why we serve and why we do things. And she still has it today. So sorry for that long windup, Ambassador, but just, that's the hardest question. Why have we ended up here? I think I would say that there are a number of reasons why we have. The first would be structural. And the interesting thing is I've sort of come back to government. This is my first opportunity to actually be outdoors or be in a room with light in 3 weeks since I started. But I could not say no to you. I would say the piece of work that has really animated a lot of Chinese thinking in the last year or two in ways that I really did not anticipate or understand fully until I got here is a book by a person that we respect and admire named Graham Allison about the Thucydides trap, this idea of how rising and falling states interact. And I have been struck in much of what I'm reading and what I'm seeing is how much Chinese friends have been animated by that framework, this idea that the United States is in the midst of some kind of decline and China is sort of rising rapidly. And I think the view in some places is that over the last 4 years, and particularly last year or so, what's happened in the United States has even accelerated some of that thinking with the view that the United States is really just in a hurtling mess, and the time in which China will assume a position, a leadership role, unchallenged on the international stage has moved up considerably. So I think those structural things probably would be there anyway, Gary. We see tensions between rising or arriving states and existing powers constantly, with existing powers trying to underscore that not so fast, we're not declining, we're still going to play a role in global politics, we're still going to play our hand on the international stage. So I think there's a structural element to this. I do believe also, and I want to say this carefully, I think there's a personal or individual role here. All of us have worked on China for years. I think we have to acknowledge that Xi Jinping is different than previous leaders, at least for a while. He's singularly focused. He's less interested in collective decision making. He makes a lot of decisions on his own. He's a bit of a strongman, a bit of an authoritarian. I think has essentially disassembled many elements of collective decision making. And I think some of his instincts are somewhat zero sum. And then I think we have to acknowledge in the United States, we have sent messages that suggest that we're uncomfortable with our role on the global stage, that we're reevaluating our trade relations, our commitment to our allies. And so it's just simply natural in that confusion and that uncertainty that other countries are reevaluating as well. So I would say there are a number of reasons, but I would also say that I think China has taken steps that I would not have imagined a couple of years ago. Simultaneously, engaging India along the border, really quite a brutal economic campaign against Australia, continuing wolf warrior diplomacy in Europe, some substantial tensions across the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, stepping up operations in and around disputed islands with Japan, the Senkaku. Many of those things, you might expect one, maybe two, but to have them all take place simultaneously is quite different than the experience that at least I've had with Chinese interlocutors, where they sometimes move out, then sort of reposition subsequently. So these are the things that we're trying to think through. This is a timely call. We're just quietly here, but President Biden will be talking to President Xi this evening. I'm going to be talking to Susan and her colleagues tomorrow just to kind of get their views and then kind of give a brief about where we are, overall. I would say just one last thing, Gary. I think there is a pretty broad recognition among the president and his most senior team that the most important ingredient in our China policy, frankly, in our role in the world, is domestic recovery. That if we cannot get the coronavirus, the domestic divisions, the profound economic discontinuity under control, we cannot somehow tackle these issues, then it's going to be difficult to play a consequential role on the international stage. I'll just close with this. We all have experience in our life that touch us. I was asked by the president's team to be one of the first people in the White House on the transition. It seems like 40 years ago. I was a much younger person, much better diet 3 weeks ago. I've never been in a city that is an armed camp like this. I've never seen Washington in such despair, with the combination of troops and barbed wire and masked people. We have to confront this, Gary, Ambassador, with some degree of humility. And I remember being bussed in after going through just unbelievable security, through security perimeters and personal searches, to actually finally be there in the White House grounds as the old team, older, tireder, gave way to a younger group of people that were just leaping into the action, but still, kind of thinking of the miraculous, even after all the challenges of the transition per se, of democratic, peaceful transition. But ultimately, Ambassador, if we can't really, more effectively conduct our affairs, then it's going to be very difficult to play the kind of consequential role on any of these other matters, technology, trade, alliance relationships, the like. I'll have more to say later about, we've had a lot of calls, a lot of interactions. I've learned a lot in the last couple of weeks that surprised me, and I'll get to that. But let me turn to Susan. She'll have a better and shorter answer.
Well, maybe shorter. But anyway, it's great to see Kurt and you, Ambassador Locke. And, the three of us could talk about China and learn a lot from one another. And we have over many years. So, of course, I'm really proud of my student, Kurt Campbell, now. And I saw, very early how he would really make a major contribution to America and to global peace. And, he did get a Marshall Fellowship, which is very, very difficult to get. So he was an outstanding student, even as an undergraduate. I just want to make that clear. So why are we in this really sorry state of U.S.-China relations? I was really shocked at how poorly the two countries did at working together on COVID, because in the past, we had managed to work together on global health problems really very effectively, even when we were at odds over many other issues. So in a way, it showed us and kind of shocked us, I think, to see just how contentious the relationship had become. And although I agree with Kurt that under Xi Jinping, the China's behavior has become even more problematic. Actually, this kind of overreaching, this overly aggressive approach to the world and even to its own society began earlier, around the time of the global financial crisis, actually even before the Asian financial crisis. And so overreach is to do things in an exaggerated way that comes back to harm yourself, to be costly to yourself. And the Chinese political system, both the collective leadership approach that was being used under Hu Jintao and the more concentrated, personalistic approach that Xi Jinping is employing, both of them seem to produce this kind of overreaching. So that's a big challenge for the United States. What's the best strategy to get China to exercise greater restraint? Is it pushback, which is what our previous administration did, basically pushback across the board in every continent, every domain, call out China's behavior publicly, which is fine. Let's call a spade, but also just try to punish and push back. And when we look at the results of all that, it didn't really do much. And as you pointed out in talking about the tariffs, it actually we ended up harming ourselves. So the challenge that Kurt Campbell and the rest of the Biden team face is, how do we compete with China without harming ourselves too much? How do we compete effectively? And how do we do that without falling into a really hostile Cold War type situation, or even worse, a direct military confrontation in the South China Sea, East China Sea, related to Korea, or some other arena? So it's really very challenging, and maybe we can talk about that next.
So let's follow up on that. When people say that, well, China is our strategic competitor, what do we mean by competitor? Are we talking about foe? Are we talking about enemy? What do we mean by that when we talk about strategic competitor? Kurt?
Well, look, Ambassador, I think one of the challenges here, and I kind of Susan alluded to it, is that sometimes the framework we use is a framework like the Cold War. The idea that countries and others are going to choose which side are you on. And it's a complete, utter misreading of Asia. I can tell you without question, every conversation I've had with every interlocutor over the course of the last three weeks, last 30 years, suggests that what Asian friends want is the United States that is active, engaged, that is purposeful, that has a constructive relationship with China where possible, but stands up where necessary. And these countries, they realize that China is just a fact of geography and life. They're not going to be choosing between us. They want both of us engaged. Frankly, it gives them more leverage, gives them more options as we go forward. So I think understanding the dynamic of how Asia actually operates is of central importance more generally. I think when people use the term, well, for me at least, what I've come to understand is that the primary areas of competition are really not over friends or allies or even military competition. I think in those areas, I'm actually quite satisfied with how the United States is doing. I think we have very good friends in Asia. They want us to succeed. I think they're worried when we are unsteady. And the military balance is such that there is substantial uncertainty on both sides. And I think that degree of uncertainty actually contributes to deterrence, which is essentially the maintenance of peace and stability. I think the arena of competition is likely to play out in a number of high-tech areas. Gary, AI, 5G and beyond, quantum computing, robotics, life sciences, et cetera. And the challenge here is multifold. I want to all encourage you to take a look at a fantastic piece that Susan Shirk and Peter Coway did at the University of California. It was published, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal, which basically makes the argument, yes, we're in a technological competition, but don't 10-foot tall the Chinese. We have lots of capacity. We have a lot of areas that, you know, if we continue, we can maintain a rather substantial degree of advantage. I think what's going to be necessary over the course of a little while, and I don't think that this is a topic that needlessly gets us into conflict with China, but recognizing that some of these technologies are strategic. We need to take some steps to protect them, and we have to take steps that will allow us to run faster, just to be as blunt as I can. I think what you indicated, Ambassador, I think the Trump administration spent too much time blocking in incoherent ways, you know, tariffs and PLA companies, when in fact, I think what's going to be necessary is a much more circumscribed effort to say, here's some technology in areas that we're going to protect, and we're going to take steps to ensure that certain secrecy and degrees of innovation are protected, to block certain efforts, but at the same time, invest in public-private partnerships, support universities, support more public spending on technology areas like semiconductors, where we have many of our advantages have eroded over time. Now, I'd love to say that this is an easy thing to do, but national investment and infrastructure strategy is right up there with reforming the tax code. It's unbelievably difficult, but that's at least the ambition is to move in that direction. I do also want to say that, and it will be reflected in the call tonight, I think the president is determined to find those areas where the United States and China, both large and small, can take little steps to try to move towards building more trust, or at least operate more effectively in an environment of greater distrust. And I do want to say to Susan and to you, Ambassador, it is not just the case that we have operated poorly with China on COVID. I now see inside the US government, we've operated poorly with everyone internationally for a whole host of reasons, not just potential competitors, but our allies. Part of what has to be done is a profound recognition that unless we deal with this tragic pandemic on a global scale, then we're not going to be able to get beyond this. And you can't solve this problem without working with China. And so it's not going to be easy, and there's lots of issues associated with distrust around what happened in Wuhan. But at the same time, as we go forward, I fully believe that we're going to find areas that we're going to be able to work together, not just with China, by the way, but with other countries like India and other like-minded states who also believe that vaccinating large parts of the South will be as essential as rapid, speedy inoculations in the industrialized world.
Professor Shirk, following up on that, is there a better way to address the issues that America and even Western countries have with China with regard to the trade and economic and trade policies? Is there a better way than the tariffs that we have imposed, or at least the unilateral tariffs that we have imposed?
Well, I think we've tested the tariff approach, and we found out that it really hasn't helped very much. In fact, we've harmed ourselves. So my expectation is that the Biden administration will be working more closely with our allies, friends, basically other like-minded countries who really care about preserving the economic rules of the game that are fair and provide for greater openness and integrity of market behavior. And I think what you'll see is efforts, first of all, to revive the WTO, do whatever we can to bring the WTO back. I mean, it's one of the few international institutions that really has some binding power, and it would be tragic to lose that institution. But there are many issues that the WTO doesn't address. So I think there will be more kind of mini-lateral efforts on technology, on investment, on standards that you will see developing. And hopefully the United States will be taking the initiative on some of those, working together with other market economies, not just democracies. I know that the Biden administration has talked a lot about bringing together all the democracies because we want to strengthen democratic values, which are threatened around the world, including in our own country. But we shouldn't limit our cooperation, especially on these economic and technology issues, just to democracies, because there are countries like Vietnam that we would want to work with, and Asia in particular, as Kurt has said, they don't want to have to choose, but they don't want to get too close to China. They're somewhat wary of China. China's so big and so near. So they really do want to maintain good relations with both countries. So we want to bring them into these multilateral efforts. And so I think you'll see a whole lot of different initiatives which are in the area of multilateral cooperation, but won't necessarily be grand schemes similar to WTO, but will be more focused. And then we won't close the door to China. They won't be aimed at China in a hostile manner. They will simply establish the standards for international competition. And if China wants to transform itself in order to join, that would be, the door will be open for that to happen. Now, of course, this raises the whole issue of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was exactly that kind of new multilateral effort. And, that will be very difficult in terms of domestic politics in the United States right now. But China, in order to try to reassure other countries and the United States about its intentions, Xi Jinping has even declared an interest in taking steps to meet the high standards of, I can never remember the first two initials, MCTPP or MT, whatever it is, the new TPP without the United States. But how ridiculous would it be for the United States to completely stand outside if China actually negotiates with Japan and takes steps to join that multilateral body? So I say, even though trade agreements are domestically really difficult in the United States, you cannot compete effectively with China without some trade initiatives coming from Washington.
And
Bester,
for,
can I just
and
jump
for
in
our,
real quick on
go ahead,
this?
go ahead, Kurt.
So I don't want to get in trouble, but I actually agree with Susan about particularly the first point. So please don't report that. We have to be careful that values is hugely important, but so many of the countries in Asia have such complicated dynamics. And so I've already heard from, you can imagine, India, Singapore, Vietnam saying, look, we're important. If you try to do one size fits all, we're going to have problems. And so I completely agree with Susan. So my hope is that we're going to have multifaceted engagements minilaterals, multilaterals. There's going to be room for lots of folks to be engaged. I think one of the big initiatives that the president's going to initiate, I think we're going to see a very high level engagement with the Quad going forward, but also a desire to start some bilateral interaction with China, with ASEAN, hopefully something in Northeast Asia involving North Korea. I know that's painful to even think about, but you're going to see across the board. But at the center of this, guys, is something that Ambassador Locke knows probably better than anyone else. The United States cannot succeed in Asia without an open, optimistic trade and commercial approach. And we are in this extraordinarily unusual situation that both of our main parties are somehow formally against trade agreements and deeply suspicious of this kind of engagement. And I would go further than Susan said. It's not just that China wants to join, but Great Britain does as well. So we've got all these nations clamoring to join an organization that we theoretically were the architects of, and we're ambivalent about. The only thing I would say, though, my only difference with Susan, I don't think China, I think China's reasons for being interested are complex. And it's not simply that they're trying to reassure us, I can assure you. They see this is competition, and that gets back to the ambassador's initial question. If the Chinese join TPP after a major initiative with Europe, it's not a high standard agreement, but it's politically significant, and signing RCEP, I'm sorry, that's, if not checkmate, all our black pieces are surrounded by white pieces on the go board, and we will have not been successful in basically coming forward with an agenda on the map that matters, which is trade. And so I can't afford to be so pessimistic on trade issues. And I'm prepared to say, look, and I have already, and I've already gotten in trouble. I'm sure you guys will be discreet here. I've made the argument that we can't go on this path. We will, doesn't matter about our military, doesn't matter about all the stuff that we propose to do with people to people and education and climate and COVID. If we can't do this other area, our strategy will have a giant hole like a donut in it.
Let's see. We have I'm going to ask that you be very brief on this next question, then we'll turn it over to the audience. How does America balance our economic engagement and trade with China against our concerns over human rights issues in China, such as involving the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and issues like even Hong Kong?
Susan, why don't you go first, and then I'll jump in.
You know, this has been a challenge in our relations with China forever. And we need to stand up for our values, and we need to call out human rights abuses in China, which have only gotten more extreme. But how do we actually bring about any positive change on the ground? It is extraordinarily difficult. The demand for change has to come from inside China. But there's one thing we can work with, which is Xi Jinping does not want to be viewed as a dictatorial leader of a big rogue state. He cares about his reputation. You only have to look at the Davos speeches to see that he wants the world to think he's doing a good job. He wants to be respected and not just feared. So that means that the normative pressure of the Human Rights Commission, of other groups that stand for democratic values, really does matter to him and does create pressure. You look at how much effort China put in, you know, on the Nobel Prize. You know, they care tremendously about that when Liu Xiaobo got the Nobel Prize. So there's a lot we can do in that space. And then, of course, the people-to-people communication with people in China. I felt so moved and sad about when they opened up this new social media platform briefly to people in China. I can't remember what it's called. It was a free conversation, uncensored conversation. And you had Han Chinese and Uyghurs from Xinjiang talking about the situation in Xinjiang. And Han Chinese really have no knowledge or understanding, or certainly no empathy for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So somehow trying to open up the conversations with foreigners, helps communicate more of that kind of information. So civil society is very, very important here.
Well, we're running out of time, and so I'm going to turn it over to the students. And we have our student assistants, Ashley Kong and Megan Peters with us. Megan is a sophomore coming from Connecticut. She's majoring in international studies. And Ashley is getting her master's degree in international service. So Ashley, why don't you pose the first question from our audience?
Hi, so thank you, Governor Locke, and thank you, Professor Shirk and Mr. Campbell for taking your time. So the question I want to pose to you, or any of you can answer this, is from Kelsey. So over the past few years, the term sharp power has emerged to describe Chinese foreign policy. Do you think this is fair, or do you think that this is reflective of non-Western othering and explicit bias? Additionally, how do we overcome anti-Chinese bias to construct the competitive, peaceful system Campbell and Doshi describe in their recent Foreign Affairs article?
Kurt, you want to take that?
I'll just start it. So Ashley, I would just say the person who popularized, made us understand more about the concept of sharp power was actually Dr. Shirk, Susan Shirk, and has written about it, and her institute in California really helped us understand it. I, alas, think it's relatively effective. What I've been struck by, we went through a period in the 90s and the 2000s where the most of what Chinese senior interlocutors that traveled the region were promoting was a kind of vision of benign power. Work with us, investments, lots of free flowing goods, Belt and Road and the like. Some suggest that it was just the growth in Chinese power, that this period passed naturally, and that China found itself in a situation where it combined now hard or sharp power and some soft power were necessary. I think something else actually happened. I think there was a sense, and this happens to great powers a lot, is they felt that they had been doing so much for friends in the region and around, and then when the time came in certain circumstances in the South China Sea and elsewhere, these countries that China felt they had been so benevolent to turned on them and took steps that they felt were antithetical to Chinese interests. And I think that hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. And I think part of what we are seeing is a reaction to this. I think that's coupled, and Ambassador, a little bit to the personality of President Xi. He believes there is a role for power, and I think he's very prepared to wield it in his bilateral interactions. And so he has tried to make clear to countries, there's a path that you can take. And if you stand against us in certain circumstances, we'll be prepared to use it. The country that's been most surprising to me in terms of where this has been exemplified really is Australia. No other country in the last 20 years has really seen such an increase in positive interactions between Australia and China. Huge exports of Australian natural resources, powering China's industrialization. And a series of steps took place in the last couple of years with really probably China overstepping in Australian domestic politics in ways that Australians are deeply, the Australians know who they are, and the Australians called the Chinese on it. And that has led to basically a tumble in relations in which China has retaliated across the board on Australian wine and lamb and you name it. And Australia feels it. And there's no sign of ease up. My guess is that going forward, that China is going to be much more comfortable with exerting, particularly in bilateral context, hard power against countries that dare to challenge it, either directly or off the clock. And I think we've seen that in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in South Korea with the decision about missiles, with Japan. We haven't really seen it towards the United States. We're always looking, always wondering, but perhaps that's the next phase to come. But I don't, actually, it's a great question. I think it is going to be a recurring feature of a China that is more assertive on the international stage and feels like countries have to pay them more respect and not stand against them.
Great. All right, let's turn to Megan with a question from a student.
Hi, thank you so much for your time today. So I have a question from Jenny. So what specifically do you think will help reset like the US relations with China with the new administration? And can relations be reset or only really evolve out of the past 4 years?
Who wants to take that one?
I think we both should, but I'm going to say what I think. I
we
believe.
have to be very brief because we're running up against the clock.
I'm sorry, Ambassador. And I appreciate you saying this. Some of these things do require there, as you know, there's just not a simple answer for some of these. I would say I think that there are strategic reasons that both the United States and China need. The Russians had a word for it. It's called peredushka. It means breathing space, a moment to stop and reflect. I think for each very separate reasons, the United States and China need that period right now. And I think during that period, we can both kind of get our house in order in the United States. I think there are at least some signs of China reevaluating some of its positions. You saw that China and India are disengaging on the border today. That's pretty significant, kind of thinking about that. I think China also probably, because of economic and other reasons, wants to find ways to work more effectively with the Biden administration, does not believe that the way it interacted with the Trump administration is effective. So I think the key is, I think both partners want to dance. They're trying to figure out how to ask each other, try to figure out who leads, what to wear, how late to stay out, those sorts of things. And I expect that to be worked out over the next little while. Susan?
Well, I think also I love that we've got this Russian term here, which I hadn't heard before, which I'll immediately start using after I look up how to spell it.
Peredushka.
Okay. But I think that we also will want to identify the priority areas in which US interests and US values have really been harmed by Chinese behavior. So not to protect the relationship, but to, get some agreement with China, test whether or not Xi Jinping still has the pragmatic gene that his predecessors had in being willing to make some compromises, bend a little, make changes, which, by the way, many of them will end up being in China's national interest, although maybe not in Xi Jinping's personal interest. And so we need to test that. We need to set priorities, and then we do need to negotiate with China. We need to sit down and talk this stuff through. And so the breathing space is important, but so is the direct communication.
All right. Ashley, a question?
So there's one more question here. This is from Lindsay. Which area do you think presents the biggest challenge for the relationship between US and China?
Well, I can just answer that I do feel the human rights issues are the most challenging. I mean, and this is based on my own experience when I had the opportunity to serve in government, even though it's more than 20 years ago. But what I experienced is that through a combination of carrots and sticks and setting priorities and negotiating, we were able to make some good progress on China's behavior as a proliferator, opening up Chinese markets, on the economic front. But in that third basket of human rights, it was extraordinarily difficult because it gets right to the pervasive fears that China's leaders have about their own society and their sense that they don't know what people really think about them because they don't have elections. And they are very fearful of some kind of large scale unrest that turns against party rule. So that is the toughest area, I would say.
Gary, I would, Ambassador, I'd close with two things. Hard to just give one. There's so many. I have to side with Susan. I am, the more you learn about the situation in Xinjiang, it's very hard not to be deeply moved by steps that do not belong in the 21st century. They just don't. We just have to be honest about that, straightforward, and not compromising about our desire to speak out, and hopefully with other countries. I also am a little worried about the cross-strait circumstances. I think the dynamics there are somewhat worrying. I don't believe that that we face in the near term the chance of an all-out military push or something along those lines. But I do believe the chances of inadvertence in this calculation are high and probably growing. And we do not have the mechanisms or the dialogue vehicles in place, Ambassador, to deal with that should we see a miscalculation. And that's always the worry when armed forces operate in proximity in a tense-filled environment. And that's what the Taiwan Straits and other parts of the South China Sea and elsewhere are becoming.
So let me follow up on the human rights issues to both of you. We got maybe about 3 minutes left. So as we pursue all these economic ties and American companies try to export more or do more business with China, are we sacrificing, are we elevating trade and economics over human rights then?
It's not so simple. And I think it's a mistake to really go at cross purposes from market incentives too much. Are we really going to intervene in, say, global financial markets? I mean, this is huge amounts of money moving around the world. Globalization involves trade, investment, financial markets. And if we really are asking all of our economic actors to change their behavior in order to punish China, is it going to be effective? Or is it simply going to convince China that we are kind of in an all-out war against them and cause them to go down the self-reliance mode even more than they have already done? And is it really going to be effective? So I think we have to be very, very targeted in our use of sanctions. And I don't think it makes sense to ask every garment and fabric manufacturer to, they should know about their supply chains, and they should try to move out of Xinjiang, but is that really going to help the situation on the ground in China?
Last question to both of you. I mentioned that the US-China relationship and the tensions between the two countries is impacting Chinese Americans and Asian Americans here in the United States. What can we do to really address that issue of harassment, discrimination, stereotyping, the prosecutions against Chinese American scientists and researchers, only to have the cases thrown out or even the government to drop them because they were completely exonerated, and the judges are even apologizing to the defendants for the lack of caution or investigation and the rush to judgment. What can we do? What can the president do, or what can leaders do?
So look, Ambassador, it's a very powerful point and a tragic one. I think we have to acknowledge that the areas of division and distrust in our own society are just profound, and probably in ways that we don't fully understand. I will say that probably the most important thing that a government can do is to set an example. And President Biden is just a deeply decent person and has spoken out against racism and bigotry and misogynism. You can go down the list. He's tried very hard to send a signal rather than spike tensions here. I do believe that this is an issue to worry about and to watch carefully, but at the same time, there are no more patriotic, supportive Americans than immigrants and folks who come to know America as their home. And I think most Americans know that and appreciate that. And so, and we have a history here, Ambassador, that you know better than I, that we have to always keep front of mind and understand the risks and the history that's very close to what transpired in the 30s and then the 40s and 50s. So I accept it. I think it's important. I think you can expect the administration to speak out on this going forward.
Susan, last word.
Well, Asian Americans are such a critical ingredient to America's success. And, when people ask me, I say the things I think are the greatest about America are public libraries and immigration. So, and we need the talent of all these people from around the world, especially from Asia. And I do feel the Trump administration went way too far in these investigations of professors, scientists. It's important that professors report all their outside activity. We have to really identify the people who are engaged in illegitimate behavior, who are actually stealing discoveries from American laboratories and passing them to China. But the way we have done this with these investigations for really basically minor reporting mistakes, some of them, others are much more egregious, but those minor reporting ones, we should be handled administratively. There's no reason to have these really high profile investigations, which have frightened, especially Chinese American and Chinese scientists in the United States, and made them feel that they don't want to be in America and they need to go back to China or leave to go somewhere else. And remember, Canada is not very far away. And so the loss of that talent and the loss of that public, the service of these folks to the American economy and our innovation ecosystem, it's just tragic. And we've already gone too far down this road, in my opinion. And I hope the Biden administration will be reviewing a lot of these practices by different administrative agencies. One of the very important steps forward in this direction is that the Biden administration now has a senior person in the White House whose job it is to look at security and technology. So you can have a more consistent approach throughout the government.
Great. Well, with that, we've actually gone a little bit over, and I know that Kurt Campbell has so much to do working for the new Biden administration with all the issues.
So many relations to ruin out there, Gary. I got to get busy.
Anyway, so thank you very much, Kurt, for taking time out of your busy schedule. And
best to everyone. Best to Susan. Love you, Susan. Good to see you, Ambassador. All the best.
All right. And Susan, thank you so much for just your insights and comments and your commitment to educating people about the U.S.-China relationship, its pluses and minuses, and its strengths and its difficulties. Also want to thank Megan Peters and Ashley Kong for our students who helped organize this and put this together and fielded the questions. Next seminar, we're going to have former Governor Rick, Rick Snyder of Michigan, who will talk, and also Fred Hochberg, who is the former head of the XM Bank, talking about the benefits and the issues about global trade and the impact of trade in our local economies to the businesses in our communities, our farms, and the American people. So that'll be next week at the same time.
Ambassador Locke, can I just mention, because I know it will be right up your alley and also of interest to other people who are interested in trade, that tomorrow, Craig Allen of the U.S.-China Business Council has done a big research project on what would be a China trade policy that would help grow U.S. employment. So he'll be speaking on the platform of 21st Century China Center. So if people go on the website of 21st Century China Center at UC San Diego, they can tune in for that.
Great. All right. Great. With that, thank you all very much. And thank you, Susan. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Megan. Thank you also Kurt Campbell, who's already had to leave for his very important duties. So, all right. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.